Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this James Cooper Kreston Academy update webinar. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of the Charities and Education team at James Cooper Kreston, and I'm joined by Catherine Wilkes, a senior manager in the team. Both of us work with lots of academies. So today's session is on our Kreston Academies Benchmark Report for 2020, which came out a couple of weeks ago. The webinar will be around 30 minutes long. Hopefully you will all have in front of you the slides, and I hope also that many of you will have had a copy of the benchmark report. If not, do get in contact with us and we will let you have a copy. In terms of questions, you will have the ability to ask questions on screen, and we will pick those up at the end. So we'll make a start in terms of the introduction. So we're going to be covering the key findings in the report for 2020. We'll be looking how multi-academy trust finances are shaping up, and you'll see as we go through the session that this is a big focus. In terms of the underlying data, around 360 academy trusts, 1,500 schools, which compares to the previous year when there were around 350 trusts and around 1,000 schools. So a small reduction in the number of trusts, but a 50% increase in the number of schools, and we will pick up on some of the reasons for that as we go through. So this survey is based on your August 2019 accounts. The data is analysed by primary, secondary and multi-academy trusts, and it can be very useful for you to compare your trust to some of the averages, and you'll see the back of the report there are some separate information for each of the three different types. So if we look at some of the highlights of the benchmark report, and a number of these we'll consider in a bit more detail as we go through, there's a much improved financial position for primary, secondaries and multi-academy trusts. So we're actually in a surplus position for all three different categories after several years in deficit, and I think the first time since 2015 that there has been a surplus. So there has been some additional income during the year, for example the Teachers Pay Grant and Philip Hammond's Little Extras as it was commonly known, although much of this income is non-recurring and not guaranteed. There is some much more significant evidence than we have seen in previous years about improved financial performance at MATs, and we've also seen increased centralisation of activities. That's something that's been talked about in a MAT context for some time, but we haven't necessarily always seen it clearly happening. As we go through, we'll see that. We're seeing a bit of an increase in GAG pooling, so general annual grant pooling, where you pull together resources of several different schools into one pot, much talked about. Still not widespread, but we will pick that up a bit later. The report also talks about some of the risks relating to financially failing schools and the impact that that may have, although I think often multi-academy trusts are under pressure from regional schools commissioners to take on some problem schools. We'll see increased cash balances at all three types of school. One of the challenges I think that many academies have is the difficulties of planning long term, because often there's an expectation that you plan for a 3-year period, for example, but income is not certain, and it can be quite difficult to do this. So, I mean, in the worst possible case, for example, if you were carrying out long-term planning, assumed that you weren't going to get a particular type of income, you made some cutbacks, and then the income materialized later on. It might well be that those cutbacks you wouldn't have actually had to have done. So, quite a challenge. The theme in terms of MATs is growth. So 70% of MATs are planning to grow in 2020, and almost half of those are looking to add more than one school. There is some evidence that as a percentage of total costs, multi-academy trusts are spending more on staff than standalone academies. We're seeing a bit of a reduction in redundancy costs, although I have to say that the actual level of redundancy costs is probably much less than people might have been expecting. Pensions is still a significant issue. Catherine will pick that one up a little bit later. And we're seeing an increased emphasis, particularly by the ESFA, about the importance of governance. Situation where if there is a problem at a school, a multi-academy trust, it is around governance that has perhaps led to that particular issue. So we'll spend some time on that. And there's also, to an extent related to governance, a focus on internal scrutiny and assurance. And there are some changes underway there which we'll pick up on later. I mean, I think in conclusion, in terms of highlights, the financial position of the sector, as you might imagine, is still uncertain despite these more positive results in this survey. So if we dive down into a bit more detail now, looking at the financial position. So there's a table here that shows the average surplus. This excludes capital income of the different types of academy over a 3-year period. 2017, I think, was a particular low point in terms of the numbers, but you'll see that since that time, all 3 categories have improved, and the position is markedly improved at Multi-Academy Trusts, where you'll see the average deficit last year was 145,000. It's now running at a surplus of around 200,000, and we are seeing some strong evidence that Multi-Academy Trusts are, much more successful financially. This is, of course, just from a financial perspective, compared to standalone academies, even allowing for the fact that there are additional schools in a multi-academy trust. So therefore, if there was a surplus, you would expect it to be bigger than a standalone school. But I think we're seeing it's running around 3 times as much, even adjusting for the number of schools. It's fair to say that many trusts, despite those more positive numbers, are still struggling. So if we were to summarise how this stronger financial position has been achieved, there is a bit more income and very careful cost control. And I think it's fair to say that the sector has responded well in terms of these financial challenges over the last couple of years. So we've mentioned Philip Hammond's little extra, something that wasn't budgeted. The teacher's pay grant. For many, and I think indeed perhaps most academies, the additional income arising from the teacher's pay grant was greater than the cost of the pay increase. So as a result, that's generated a surplus. There's quite a lot of pressure on special educational needs and disability income. I think there's some evidence that local authorities are making it harder for individual pupils to meet the relevant criteria. And there's a lot of evidence that the funding isn't enough. Although interestingly, in terms of the special schools in the survey, there was some evidence that there was a bigger surplus per pupil than at other schools. The late notification of funding, as we said earlier, has been a big challenge. So even though there may be a requirement to plan over a 3-year period, the funding is really announced pretty much 1 year at a time. Of course, we do have the budget in a couple of weeks' time, so no doubt there will be some announcements around spending in a couple of weeks, early March. The 3-year budget forecast returns that academies have been preparing are showing increasing deficits. So it may be that 2019 is a one-off good year, if you like, although it may not always feel that it's a good year, but certainly the numbers are far more positive than they have been. And as I've mentioned, the importance of long-term planning, albeit there are many difficulties in doing that. So if we look in a little bit more detail at income, then there's masses of data in the benchmark report on this. I think we have seen a downward average general annual grant income for secondaries as a consistent trend since 2014. Even after around 9 years of academies, there is still little evidence of significant additional income streams. Many academies are renting out premises, for example, but are really finding it hard to generate some very significant streams. There is still little evidence of that parents are making a huge contribution in terms of donations to schools, although often cases where schools are asking parents for donations do create quite a lot of publicity in the press. The importance of pupil numbers, I think, probably goes without saying. So schools are looking quite closely at the competition in terms of other schools, because at the end of the day, in a geographic area, there may well be some competitions. There may be issues around, particularly perhaps in the areas such as Oxfordshire, where there's a lot of housing development going on. That can be quite positive in terms of pupil numbers. at an individual school. And of course, maintaining the reputation of the school is particularly important. So in that context, obviously having good Ofsted reports is a great challenge, but increasingly these days, but also very important in terms of attracting pupils to your school. So far, the increase in the teachers' pension costs, teachers' pension scheme costs has been funded, and hopefully we will see that continue. No additional funding there for independent schools, but in the maintained sector, funding is there. And of course, we've had some announcements in terms of minimum per pupil funding in terms of primaries, and the much publicised £5,000 per pupil for secondaries for 2021, and we will see how that pans out into the future. We have mentioned special needs funding. I think the position there is likely to get increasingly worse, and local authority deficits are building up. So during our webinars, we like to run a couple of polls just to get some audience participation. So our first one here is special needs funding a significant issue for your academy? So you'll see there that there are 3 options: yes, no, I don't know. So if you could just take a few seconds considering that, and we will let you know the results. So the votes are coming in. I'll just give you a few more seconds. Okay, so I think we'll close the poll now. So around about 60% are saying that it is a significant issue for their school, 43% saying no. So I think there is some evidence that backs up national data that is a significant matter. So if we move on more specifically to multi-academy trusts, so this is their direction of travel. There are more multi-academy trusts. There's focus from the ESFA and regional schools commissioners on improving the quality of maths, and there has been a degree of rebrokering and indeed a decreased amount of rebroking of underperforming schools to different maths. In terms of the number of academy schools and the number of maths, I think the data here nationally is consistent with our survey. So I think overall there's a 2% reduction in the actual number of trusts, but the number of schools is up by around 12%. So I think we will see that trend continue. And this is backed up by the figures of the average schools per maths. So we will see that back in 2016 it was just over an average of 3, and that's now 5.5. So that has increased, and we expect to see that continue, particularly on the back of the fact that 70% of the maths are looking to grow in 2020. There is the challenge of underperforming schools, and there is quite a detailed section in the report around the challenges that gives and the financial implications. So quite a significant difference between surpluses of multi-academy trusts with a problem school and those without. Of course, you will be aware some of the challenges of these types of schools. They take up an increased amount of management time because some of the challenges and problems have arisen perhaps due to weak management. The ESFA is encouraging MATs to use the firm-wide resources to help support academies who are in difficulty. Perhaps this is a forerunner to them encouraging MATs to pool all their funding. And of course the ESFA and Regional Schools Commission is encouraging MATs to accept problem schools, but it can destabilise them. So some quite interesting challenges there. I suppose in terms of key messages, one would be before a new academy joins your multi-academy trust, making sure you carry out adequate due diligence, and I think making sure that problems are addressed quite quickly, because of course they can escalate. In terms of other math issues, we're seeing a much bigger move towards a more centralised model. So for example, 46% now centralising the finance function in one location rather than having it located at lots of different schools, which is something that wasn't the case in the past. We are seeing a bit more of a trust-wide approach to school improvement. In terms of GAG pooling, I think we only had 3 MATs in our survey last year who were doing it. The number is up to 10, so it's still a relatively small number overall, but it is quite a significant increase, and I imagine that that number is likely to increase significantly in the future. In terms of the issues around GAG pooling, I think the biggest issue that was reported was internal political issues, the perception that if there are several schools in the Multi-Academy Trust that there will be some winners and losers from the pudding, so often inertia means that nothing actually happens. In terms of central services charge, which is often of interest, most particularly often to the individual academies and Multi-Academy Trust in terms of how the centre charges for its services, it's still fair to say that the majority are using a percentage of income, and in terms of the percentages that are used, around 50% are using 5%, and 80% are in the 4 to 6% range. So that's a common theme. But I suppose the key thing there in terms of that is making sure that it's clear what you're paying for in that central service charge, and that as an individual academy you are getting some value for money. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to talk about costs. Catherine.
Okay, staff costs continue to be a significant cost for academies, with total costs being in the region of 70%. There's been an ongoing focus on demonstrating value for money amongst head teacher and senior leaders' pay, and we are seeing some evidence of restraint of head teachers' remuneration. And we also understand that the guidance on setting executive salaries has helped. It's been well received in the sector. Impacting this year's staff costs has been the new teacher pay rates that came into effect from September 2018, but also some additional funding to cover this. But for how long, we just don't know. The next challenge will be the announcement of the increase in salaries for new teachers, the starting salary for new teachers of £30,000, which will be in place by 2022 to 23. We think this will obviously have budgetary pressures, but also help attract some graduates to the profession, which will be a good thing. We've seen that the restructuring costs are slightly lower following a peak in 2017, and it looks like a lot of the tough decisions have now been made. And the debate continues about how you fill a vacancy. We're going to go on to our second poll question now to find out your thoughts on this subject. Are you filling vacancies with cheaper teachers? And the answers are yes, no, or don't know. We're just going to give you a few minutes or a few seconds to respond to this. Okay, I think we'll close the poll there. It's 50-50, which is an interesting result actually. Okay, we'll move on to non-staff costs. So these have been pretty consistent with prior years, but obviously still a significant cost. We're seeing these are being well controlled within the sector, and we're seeing some ups and downs within the categories, but no clear pattern. We're seeing that savings are harder to find now. The branch has been shaken to get all the easy savings out there, and now schools are on a journey to search harder for savings and keep costs at a lower level. One idea that MATs are using is to introduce a common exam board across their school, all the schools within the MATs or the secondary schools, so that teachers can teach across multiple schools, either by desire or to cover absences. We're seeing an awareness of value for money, and also seeing more monitoring of the financial position with monthly reviews, which is a great thing to see. SRMAs. These have happened in some of our schools during the year, and this has been a positive experience for most, amongst some controversy. Those visited have identified some cost savings, but most of the schools within our survey hadn't actually had a visit yet. And this is now being linked with the conditional improvement funding, and as you'll be aware of the letter from the DFE, making an SRMA now effectively a condition of some SIF funding. So it's going to make it even more of a lottery and even harder to get hold of. We're seeing fewer savings coming through within MATs, implying that it's already quite lean, there are economies of scale there, and these trusts are performing better financially. Okay, thinking about reserves and cash balances now. There's been an increase in the average free reserves, and this is seen positively within the sector after a downward trend of the past few years. It's important to have reserves for a number of reasons, covering emergency repairs as a buffer in uncertain times, especially with the funding in the situation currently. You've got the national funding formula, you've got the teachers' pay grant and the uncertainty over the future of this, and also the increase in the starting salary for teachers of the £30,000. Most trusts are opting for a 1 month reserves policy, and that can either be 1 month of income or expenditure. We're seeing that the distinction between cash and reserves is generally well understood within the sector now. Cash flow is important, but understanding reserves is critical also. We're seeing that cash balances overall have increased across the sector, except within the single academy primary sector. And we think this is probably due to the additional funding received, that trusts are holding on to this funding, costs are being controlled, and this is something that trusts do deserve credit for. But this also ignites the debate about whether this money should be used for the pupils on roll currently, or whether this should be kept for costs in the future. So in terms of fixed assets, land and buildings specifically, in our survey, there was a total of £7 billion of land and buildings, which is just staggering. There are two main forms of funding for fixed assets, being the school conditional allocation, which is only available to MATs of 5 or more academies with over the golden 3,000 pupils, or through conditional improvement funding applications, which can be a bit of a lottery. There's also uncertainty about other funding grants, in particular the Healthy Pupils Capital Fund and also the Little Extras, which was in place for 1 year there. We're seeing an increase in capital expenditure in 2019, and this is following a drop in 2018, and we think this is probably a catch-up is happening in 2019. We are also seeing that MATs are investing more per pupil, which suggests that MATs can plan better, but also that MATs are able to get access to more funding than other trusts. We've also seen that maintenance expenditure has been static, which is surprising given the little extras that was received during the year, but not all of these little extras may have been spent so far. So in terms of pensions, there are two types of pension schemes. There's the teacher's pension scheme and the local government pension scheme. Both of these are defined benefit pension schemes, and both of these are expensive for trusts. The teacher's pension scheme is now taking up over 8% of GAG income. And also, as you'll be aware, the teacher pension scheme contributions increased from 16.4% to 23.6% from September 2019, which is a staggering increase of 43% in absolute terms. And although this is being currently funded, we don't know what will happen in the future. And this will also be adding pressure to budgets. And also with the increase in starting salary of teachers to £30,000, it will obviously have a knock-on impact on the whole pay scale and obviously on the TPS contributions as well. We are seeing some of the independent schools leaving the TPS or considering leaving as well. And what we've also seen is an increase in the LGPS deficits as a result of discount rates and life expectancy changes, and also as an impact of the McLeod and Sargent cases. I'll hand back over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So we're running well to time. Just a few more minutes and then we'll deal with a few questions that have come in. So in terms of internal scrutiny and assurance, for those of you that have been involved with the academy sector for some time, this is often what was known and still in some areas known as responsible officer work or RO work. So I think the view here is that trusts are becoming bigger and more complex, and the ESFA consider poor governance and financial controls are often factors in failing academies, so they really want the sector to carry out more work itself to make sure that problems don't arise. So there is an increased emphasis on this and the 2019 Academies Financial Handbook. Also for the 1920 year, so the year that we're in now, trusts have to share a summary report with the ESFA on the work that they've done on internal scrutiny. So if this is something you haven't done, I think it's something you need to consider reasonably soon. There is now a requirement, it's a must, that you need to have a risk register, which is in common with other charities. But perhaps mention that this area around scrutiny and assurance is not just about financial controls. It can consider all sorts of other areas such as governance, IT, compliance with safeguarding, HR matters, etc. So take account of all forms of assurance. So it may well be that some of these other areas you might gain some assurance from an inspection that you may have had, for example, by Ofsted. There's a suggestion of considering more formal internal audit programs. So just as an example, further education colleges often have a 30-day program of internal audit work that's carried out by external parties during the year. Now, I don't think we're in that position yet, but that may well be something in terms of direction of travel where we move in that direction. So perhaps trusts that have a couple of days of internal assurance work at the moment may have more in the future. And there's also a suggestion that you should be considering an audit committee. I mean, the formal requirement for an audit committee is where income is over 50 million, so this will need to be a reasonable size multi-academy trust. But even if you don't have a separate audit committee, perhaps the finance committee, if you have one of those, is an area, as a committee that should take responsibility for these types of matters. So I'd encourage you to familiarise yourselves with the requirements on internal scrutiny and assurance. And then the final section that we're going to cover today is the benchmarking report in terms of governance. So there is a lengthy section on governance in the report. You won't be surprised to know that the ESFA has made lots of pronouncements in this area. Lord Agnew's very vocal in stressing the importance of effective governance. But I think recognising that there are some quite significant governance challenges and increased time pressure as the world gets more and more complicated around legislation, responsibilities, etc. It is more difficult for people to find the time. And I think there's also a question of having the right skills on board. So many charities are now, many academies and indeed charities are carrying out skills audits to establish whether they do have the right skills in lots of different areas. So interesting data around the size of the board. So the average number of trustees in a multi-academy trust is now 10. Interesting, it was 13 back in 2016. I think this is a reasonable number. There's slightly more in secondary schools. They have an average of 13. Multi-academy trusts, interestingly, have an average of 9. I personally believe that around 10 is often likely to be a good number. I think once you get beyond 15 and above, it then becomes quite difficult to manage a board of that size. As you might imagine, there is a big diversity challenge around boards. So 80% of trustees are over 40 and 5%, only 5% from an ethnic minority. So the boards are not really fully reflective of our community. There's also a suggestion that academies should review their committee structure to work out how that works, making sure that you have appropriate committees dealing with, for example, education, finance, etc. And then, of course, in the multi-academy trust context, you may have some local governing bodies. And the ESFA is also keen for academies to carry out external governance reviews. So I think around 19% or so multi-academy trusts have had a review, but the number for a single academy trust is less than 10%. So that may well be something worth looking at if you have some obvious governance challenges. So quite a big area to look at into the future. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. So we've had some questions that have come through. So someone's asked, when you refer to deficits, do you mean an in-year deficit or a cumulative deficit? Well, the data in our report is the in-year deficit rather than the accumulated deficit, and there is quite a lengthy section on pages 5 and 6 of the report which details how these numbers are calculated in terms of things like depreciation, capital income, and pension costs. So, but it's the in-year numbers rather than the cumulative figures. There's a question that's come through on reserves. Catherine, would you like to deal with that one?
Yes, the question is, what is the correct level of reserves? Well, it's a good question, and there is no right or wrong answer. We are seeing generally between 1 and 3 months of income or expenditure as the free reserves. Most are opting for 1 month. It will depend on your circumstances, and obviously the level of your reserves needs to be well thought through so it could be justified.
And then the final question that we've had through is, are there likely to be any increases in teachers' pension scheme costs in the future? Well, that's a great question. I'll get my crystal ball out. I think we've seen over recent years the contributions are old enough to remember the days when I think it was 8%, then it was 14.1, then 16.4, and now it's gone to 23.6, which was much higher than any commentators predicted. I think the indications were from people in the know that it would be somewhere between 18 and 20%. It seems that the only direction of travel in anything to do with pension costs is it gets more and more expensive. Of course, academies are in the position that at the moment these increases are funded, but of course we don't know whether that will continue into the future. I think many independent schools, as Catherine mentioned, have taken the view that it's simply unaffordable and have chosen to leave the scheme or are in the process of leaving the scheme. Of course, that option isn't available to academies. I mean, this has a number of potential implications for the academy sector. And one is in terms of the teachers' pension scheme as a whole. If the independent schools aren't paying, and then the funding situation of the scheme will change into the future. And the second is potentially around recruitment, because it may well be that a teacher who is at an independent school and who is considering pension options is unhappy that that school may be leaving the teachers' pension scheme, might consider it as an attractive move to move into the academy sector. So quite a lot of moving parts in the. I appreciate I haven't really answered the question as to whether it's likely to increase. I think the likelihood is pretty likely that it's going to be less. I think we've seen in the private sector over many years that many of the final salary schemes have closed down. Whether that's something that happens in the public sector schemes, we'll have to wait and see.
I've got one final question, which is about whether a copy of this recording will be available, which it will be on our website.
Okay, so thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for Catherine for her contribution. I hope you found it useful. So it's on the website. So if you have any colleagues who you think might be interested in watching it, do refer it on to them. I hesitate to suggest that the podcast of this presentation is going to go viral, but it would be great if thousands and thousands of people watched it. And then finally, if you do have any other queries that you think of at a later date, you'll see on that final slide that Catherine and my details are there. We'd be very happy to pick up any questions that you have. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll join one of our webinars in the future. Thank you.